Trump's going to scream about Haitian immigrants eating cats. And then J.D. Vance is going to come in and be like, well, actually, there's some complicated legalese you need to know. It's Wednesday, October 2nd. I'm Jane Coaston.
And I'm Todd Zwillich.
And this is What A Day, the show where, God help us, we watched last night's vice presidential debate so you didn't have to.
On today's show, J.D. Vance does his impression of a normal guy who's never said he's proud of lying to everyone in the country. Plus, Tim Walz knows who won the 2020 election, but is he alone?
We're recapping last night's vice presidential debate between Ohio Senator J.D. Vance and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. It was also likely the final debate of the election cycle as of right now. Generally speaking, the rule of thumb for vice presidential debates is do no harm to your respective campaign. And by that measure, I think both men largely succeeded. It was a tense 90 minutes, way more focused on policy than the two previous presidential debates, and neither Vance nor Walz committed any egregious errors that's likely to come back and seriously haunt them. A CBS poll of debate watchers says that Vance won 42%, Walz won 41%, and 17% said it was a tie. But did you think there was a winner, Todd? Like, that it was a weird moment because it was a very tense debate, but it also felt normal in a way that we haven't seen in 8 years.
Yeah, there was so much of this that made me feel like I was watching like video hits on VH1 from the 90s, like just a kind of political nostalgia from high school that was weird. People venturing to agree and trying to make cogent arguments and the rest of it. I don't know. I mean, I think if I was watching through the eyes of an uncommitted voter in Wisconsin, for the three of them that are actually left, by the way, I don't think undecideds really exist. It's a myth. But let's say that that's who you're going for in this polarized partisan election. I guess J.D. Vance would have won on points, but then like if you just like scratch the first two skin cells off of that, I mean, so much of it was complete, not only falsehoods, but really cogent and coherent in ways that the candidate, Donald Trump, never has been, never will be, and can't be, doesn't have the ability to be.
Yeah, I was really interested, and I'm interested to hear what your thoughts. Like, what was the benchmark of success here? Because it really seemed to be, for lack of a better term, don't screw up or throw up on television. And neither of them did so. So, like, It seemed like, I mean, I was trying to think earlier, like, was there a vice presidential debate that I really remember? And I vaguely remember Paul Ryan, Joe Biden back in 2012 because they got into a sad-off, and you don't get into a sad-off with Joe Biden. But that's pretty much about it. But I think that what really drew the contrast was just in comparison with the last two presidential debates, because they featured Donald Trump, this was civil.
And, you know, look, to the extent that we have a tradition in this country of vice presidential debates not to remember, this one probably qualifies. So, you know, in that sense, completely forgettable. I mean, I think we saw two guys trying to give up the vitriolic partisanship, the race baiting, the immigrant bashing, all of that, of the actual campaign, and come into a room that says, okay, there's 4 people in Michigan, 8 people in Wisconsin, and a smattering of people in Pennsylvania who still consider themselves undecided. They might not like Donald Trump, but say he had good policies, or they might kind of be Kamala curious, but I've never voted for a Democrat before. So that's what I saw these two politicians kind of going for. And the weirdness of it is, especially on Vance's side, but to an extent on Tim Walz's side too, that's not who either of them is in this campaign, like at all, like at all. That's not the role either of them has ever played. J.D. Vance has been like a press baiting, race baiting, nativistic, immigrant bashing person. There was just a whole lot of trying to leave the reality of the rest of the campaign aside and kind of get into like a moon bounce room together where the walls are soft. Well, unlike the first two debates, the VP debate was actually pretty civil. In fact, if you read a transcript of this debate, you'd find that Walz and Vance actually said a lot of things they agreed upon, as we just said. In an answer about childcare, here's an example. Vance conceded that the government would have to pay more to offset the crippling costs that families face.
As Tim said, a lot of the child care shortages, we just don't have enough resources going into the multiple people who could be providing family care options. And we're going to have to, unfortunately, we're going to have to spend more money. We're going to have to induce more people to want to provide child care options for American families, because the reason it's so expensive right now is because you've got way too few people providing this very essential service.
And Walz agreed with Vance that decades of international trade agreements and globalization haven't necessarily been great for the average American worker.
Look, I'm a union guy on this. I'm not a guy who wanted to ship things overseas, but I understand that, look, we produce soybeans and corn. We need to have fair trading partners. That's something that we believe in. I think the thing that most concerns me on this is Donald Trump was the guy who created the largest trade deficit in American history with China. So the rhetoric is good. Much of what the senator said right there, I'm in agreement with him on this. I watched it happen too. I watched it to my communities, and we talked about that. But we had people undercutting the right to collectively bargain. We had right to work states made it more difficult. We had companies that were willing to ship it over, and we saw people profit.
I think what gets me from this is that you're going to have a bunch of people who saw this and were like, this is what I've missed from presidential debates. But those same people, many of them, voted for Donald Trump. They voted for the person who stirs things up, the guy, the horse in the hospital, to borrow that line from the comedian John Mulaney.
This guy being the president, it's like there's a horse loose in a hospital.
And so it's interesting to me because these are two people who, if they had been both in the Senate at a less polarized time, there would have been a lot of Vance Walz acts or this bill or something like that. Do you think that that was a strategy to come off as work across the aisle guys, even when one of them is, Donald Trump's running mate?
Yeah, I think it totally is. I mean, look at the entire theme of Kamala Harris's campaign, right? It doesn't have to be like this. Turn the page from this. Now she's talking about Donald Trump and all the ugliness, but also talking about the parts of politics, the screaming and yelling that turn off a lot of low information voters and people who don't engage with it like you and I do. So I try to view this debate through the eyes of blue wall, working class, undecided voters, all 14 of them. And that's who this whole thing was programmed toward. I think they both knew it.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, because there are a host of people, and I think you and I have both heard it over and over again, where they got so mad at Mitt Romney or Paul Ryan or John McCain because they didn't fight enough, because they were fighting for conservative ink and they didn't get mad enough. So it's just funny to hear people online, you see it tonight, being like, this is what politics could be like. And I'm like, yeah, but who did this? You did it. You brought the horse into the hospital.
No one knows what the horse is going to do next, least of all the horse. He's never been in a hospital before.
And I mean, Tim Walz got the job by coming up with the most elegant attack line that Democrats can never find. These guys are just weird, and went at it and at it and at it and really isolated Republicans from the sensibilities of a lot of Americans. Kamala Harris shot up in the polls and chose Tim Walz. He didn't bring any of that energy tonight. And he has that energy, right? Because he came up with that attack line. So he just decided not to bring it, I guess. And I just want to say that Donald Trump got famous for a couple of weeks ago for going on a weird, rambling answer. I mean, it was all over social media when he was asked about childcare and just sort of said childcare 9 times. J.D. Vance gave the answer that the candidate can't even come close to giving, whether or not you agree with the policy. So to me, again, stark relief. It just jumped off the screen for me. There was this moment in the debate where Vance was asked about Donald Trump's plans for healthcare after Trump famously, again, said in the last debate that he had concepts of a plan to replace the Affordable Care Act with something much better.
He actually implemented some of these regulations when he was president of the United States. And I think you can make a really good argument that it salvaged Obamacare, which was doing disastrously until Donald Trump came along. And I think this is an important point about President Trump. Of course, you don't have to agree with everything that President Trump has ever said or ever done. But when Obamacare was crushing under the weight of its own regulatory burden and health care costs, Donald Trump could have destroyed the program. Instead, he worked in a bipartisan way to ensure that Americans had access to affordable care. It's not perfect, of course, and there's so much more that we can do, but I think that Donald Trump has earned the right to put in place some better health care policies. He's earned it because he did it successfully the first time.
Now, to be clear, that is complete and total bullshit. Like, you and I were alive when John McCain was the one person who helped to save the Affordable Care Act. The lowest moment of Donald Trump's polling was when he was attempting to overturn the Affordable Care Act. Do you remember in 2016, there was a whole health care for everyone, and it was like, we were going to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and I don't know, let Paul Ryan decide.
In 2 weeks.
Yeah, we were going to let Paul Ryan decide on everything. And then, it's been 8 years and we still don't have a healthcare plan. But I think that this goes to your point of like, JD Vance was able to lie effectively on this point. Effectively for people who apparently don't remember the Trump administration, but he did so nonetheless.
Or don't have any connection to healthcare policy, which thankfully is most of us. I mean, it was a very well thought out, beautiful answer that was just completely false. I mean, Trump went to the mat politically over and over and over again to try to repeal the ACA. He reportedly hated it specifically because it was called Obamacare. That was the thing that really bothered Trump about it when he became president. We don't have time to go into all the reasons why that's false, except they voted about 59 times in Congress to try to repeal it. When they finally failed, Republicans voted down Trump's appeal to protect Medicaid. Trump did make a couple of regulatory changes during his presidency to the ACA. They were almost all to weaken it.
Absolutely. There were, numerous candidates ran on repeal and replace, and you will never hear anyone say that ever again. But we have to talk about abortion because it's been a huge issue this election cycle. It's a huge issue for millions of people. After the Supreme Court's conservative justices overturned Roe versus Wade 2 years ago, Vance has been hammered on the campaign trail for supporting abortion bans with no exceptions. And his infamous comment about how childless cat ladies are a threat to democracy. And there was a moment where it was clear that Vance was trying to soften the edges of the Republican Party's stance on abortion because he knows how bad it is. He reiterated Trump's claims that the issue is better handled by the states, but also sidestepped a direct question about why he backed off his earlier position supporting a federal abortion ban.
One of the things that changed is in the state of Ohio, we had a referendum in 2023, and the people of Ohio voted overwhelmingly, by the way, against my position. And I think that what I learned from that, Nora, is that we've got to do a better job at winning back people's trust. So many young women would love to have families. So many young women also see an unplanned pregnancy as something that's going to destroy their livelihood, destroy their education, destroy their relationships. And we have got to earn people's trust back.
See, what's interesting there is it's not earning people's trust back by saying that we're going to support women's right to choose. It's earning people's trust back so that young women will have more babies. It's interesting because J.D. Vance and I are from the same area of Southern Ohio. He went to public school. I went to Catholic school. And so I went to Catholic school and I was educated to believe that having sex was the single worst thing you could do. Worse than murder, and that if you got pregnant while you were in high school or got pregnant outside of marriage, you were a criminal who was supposed to be shunned, and you were the worst person who had ever lived. And so it's just been wild to me, wild to watch this retconning of the upbringing that J.D. Vance and I were, around-ish the same age. He's a little older than I am. But to see this retconning of that entire era, and also the way that, again, he is using this linguistic trick to, at no point is he saying that we have to win back the trust of American women who want access to abortion. He is saying we need to win back the trust of American women so that they won't have abortions, so that they won't do the thing that I don't want them to do, so that they won't make a decision that I don't want them to make. That's not what choice looks like. Choice looks like letting women make decisions on their own, not like herding women towards a decision and congratulating yourself for doing so.
I can't say it any better than that, but I would just like to quote J.D. Vance from 2022 when he was running for Senate, asked about a national abortion ban. I know he says that now that Ohio has voted, he's changed his view, but you tell me if you buy it. Quote, J.D. Vance, this is according to Rolling Stone. Okay, Ohio bans abortion, let's say in 2024, which happened. And then, or Roe v. Wade was overturned. And then every day, George Soros sends a 747 to Columbus to load up disproportionately black women to get them to go have abortions in California. And of course, the left will celebrate this as a victory for diversity. That was J.D. Vance 2 short years ago in 2022. So look, what this says to me, Jane, is that whatever internals Republicans might have on the gender gap, women voters, or abortion in particular in this election, might be a lot worse than is even reflected in the public polls. I mean, J.D. Vance completely climbed down from all of his previous statements on abortion, national abortion ban, women's rights. Donald Trump was tweeting during this part of the debate saying, of course I would never sign a national abortion ban. He was asked 3 times in his debate with Kamala Harris, and he specifically would not answer the question because it was too politically sticky. Even Donald Trump knew not to grab onto that one. So I can't say for sure, but I'm watching how this talented politician presents himself here, and I think the gap that we know they're losing on this issue might be way worse than even we know. I don't know for sure.
I will say again, most of this debate was pretty civil, but the tone really started to shift at the very end when the moderators asked Walz and Vance questions about January 6th, which you might remember, pretty big day. In one of Walz's strongest moments of the night, to me, he directly asked Vance about Trump's insistence that he didn't lose the last election.
And I would just ask that, did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future. Did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation?
That is a damning non-answer.
It's a damning non-answer for you to not talk about censorship. Obviously, Donald Trump and I think that there were problems in 2020. We've talked about it. I'm happy to talk about it further.
Bullshit. Anyway, Walz closed out the portion of the debate by suggesting to viewers that if Vance is VP, Trump would have no guardrails.
He lost the election. This is not a debate. It's not anything anywhere other than in Donald Trump's world. Because look, when Mike Pence made that decision to certify that election, that's why Mike Pence isn't on this stage. What I'm concerned about is, where is the firewall with Donald Trump? Where is the firewall if he knows he could do anything, including taking an election, and his vice president's not going to stand to it? That's what we're asking you, America. Will you stand up? Will you keep your oath of office, even if the president doesn't? And I think Kamala Harris would agree. She wouldn't have picked me if she didn't think I would do that, because of course that's what we would do.
And it seems like such an obvious question, but it's so interesting to me that Vance is unable to answer it. He tries to pivot away to talk about like a very online issue. I mean, I'm sure he was mere moments away from bringing up the Twitter files, but like, who won the 2020 election? He can't say. And he said routinely, like, oh, I would have done something with electors or something like that, that Mike Pence made the wrong choice. And all of this is because a petty man believes that he won something that he lost. And it's wild to me that J.D. Vance is in this vice of needing to perform normalcy for a general audience, including lots of people who know who won the 2020 election, but also needing to impress one petty asshole.
Well, if he says what he knows about the 2020 election and speaks true to it, he becomes Mike Pence. I mean, it's as simple as that. I think that Tim Walz kind of pointed that out in a more roundabout way. I would have expected another Tim Walz to drill down on the fact that Donald Trump wants to pardon January 6th offenders, has immunity now given to him by the Supreme Court. He didn't mention Trump's multiple dozens of felony charges in this context. You know, Kamala Harris did all that stuff in her debate. So this, again, like, you really saw Tim Walz that said, okay, we've made that argument. There's a couple people in the blue wall states who are kind of middle of the road or don't want to hear politicians screaming, and that's who I'm going to appeal to, even in a way softening some of the edges around the January 6th argument, you know? And I think we know that Walz knows more about that issue than he laid on the line there. And for whatever reason, he felt like that was as far as he could go.
Welcome back to What A Day. For more analysis of the Veep debate, Walz and Vance's performance, and what, if anything, this means for our election or for our lives, joining me in the studio is Pod Save America's own Tommy Vietor. Hi, Tommy.
Hi, my friend. I was told we'd be talking about Iranian ballistic missile strikes.
Yeah, we're going to get into a really in-depth conversation of the history of Iran-Lebanese relations.
Okay,
but like first,
the debate.
What, if anything, surprised you tonight?
I thought it was really interesting that J.D. Vance signaled through his staff and the media that he was going to go hard at Tim Walz and go after his service record and his time in the military, and then was very ostentatiously friendly and agreeable and nice to Tim Walz.
So what were your expectations going into tonight's debate? Because one of the funny things about vice presidential debates is that, like, you can screw them up, but you can't really, like, move the needle in a big way traditionally. So what were you thinking going in, and what do you think now?
I mean, honestly, my expectation going in was kind of what we saw. Like, I watched some of Tim Walz's old debate performances. It looked a lot like what you saw tonight. Like, he's a little gruff. He sometimes speaks in sentence fragments, wasn't polished. JD Vance, on the other hand, looks like he's been on the debate team his whole life. And he's sort of like that annoying kid you knew in high school.
I hate debate team energy.
That really cared about the debate team. And so I think, the instant reaction out of the debate you saw on social media, because we all follow a bunch of political pundits, was all on style. And then some of the polling came through, and it seemed like actual normal voters actually really liked Tim Walz. I mean, actually, they both helped their favorabilities in the polls, but mostly people I don't know, it was sort of boring, but also nice compared to what they're used to. It's weird that this debate might be the last big moment of the campaign, because it doesn't seem like they're going to debate again. In an election this close, a few thousand votes in a swing state can really matter, and maybe the debate tonight will impact that many voters. But my guess is we all forget about it in 2 days.
What a glorious 2 days it'll be. So I think the moment that the Harris campaign has already clipped, the moment that a lot of people are going to remember is Vance's non-answer on January 6th, where he was like, oh, clearly Donald Trump and I had some differences on the 2020 election, but let's talk about Kamala Harris. And what was clearly implied was talking about online censorship, which is a very online issue.
Totally.
It kind of goes to my earlier thought, though, that this was a moment in which Vance was he has to thread this needle of, I'm going to seem like a normal person, but I am also Donald Trump's running mate, who is not a normal person.
Right.
How do I do this? And that was apparently what he came up with.
That is why his job is so hard, because really he should be performing for the audience of 330 million Americans who could vote for him in the ticket.
Yeah.
But he's actually performing for the audience of one, which is Donald Trump, and can't contradict him on this issue, even though it's wildly unpopular amongst the electorate, and I think is viewed as kind of a proxy for being an extremist if you think that January 6th was okay. So that was clearly his worst moment. That was what was blowing up my group chats, but those are a bunch of libs. I mean, you have a more eclectic group of friends.
That seemed to be the moment where I was following I follow a bunch of conservatives. And that was the moment where it was kind of this was a tough moment for you to just not, especially because Walz is that's not an answer.
Yeah.
You didn't actually say what happened. And so I think that was a moment where you saw a bunch of conservatives who were really happy with Vance in the same way that I think Vance is like Ron DeSantis. That's who a lot of conservatives really wanted. It's just that the people who vote didn't. But that was clearly a moment in which they were like, oof.
They went quiet.
Something people have brought up a lot is that Walz hasn't been doing as many interviews lately. He was all over the place. He was with you on Pod Save. Should the Harris-Walz campaign be getting him out more? Because I think that was something people were talking about. Oh, Vance has done a lot of hard interviews, which I'm like, well, if you say insane shit, people are going to ask you about the insane shit that you say. But Walz hasn't been on the trail or talking to reporters as much.
There was a CNN poll where Tim Walz's favorabilities before the debate were plus 14 and after the debate were plus 37, which to me says people liked what they saw.
Yeah.
So let's get him out there more. Let's get him in, non-traditional media. Dan just reminded me, he just did the Rate That Dog or I Pet That Dog account.
Yeah.
That's fun. Kamala Harris was just on the All the Smoke podcast. He can go out and talk to Sports World. I mean, I think I would love to see Tim Walz just hit the gas. Yeah. Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, everyone hit the gas. Don't worry about making a mistake. Just talk to people. Because I think the hardest thing in politics is not honing the message. It's reaching people in 2024 when they're checked out of politics.
Right. Especially because I think that if you just do one big interview, it becomes my God, the most important thing that you've ever done.
Right.
But, Harris has been actually doing a fair number of interviews. She's been doing a lot of local media, which I like. But I'm also get on some podcasts, talk to some people. You're a likable person and people seem to respond to you.
I totally agree. I mean, I think, one of the first things Kamala Harris did was the biggest local ABC station in Philly. And that's really smart because a lot of people are going to watch that. You're going to get in front of folks who are key swing voters. But I think this All the Smoke podcast interview that Harris just did, it's with two former NBA players. Normally that audience is just there to hear about basketball. But they heard from Kamala Harris. You might not ever reach those people otherwise. So thinking about spaces like that where she can just get out. She should talk to the political reporters who are on the trail with her. She should talk to the local press, but think like, okay, who do we need to reach and how do we get to them?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much for joining me, Tommy.
I love this, a tradition like the Masters. It's
I know, but it's
sweating it out in this room.
Yeah, but it's a tradition that isn't boring and we don't have to whisper.
That's right.
So, Todd, part of the rules for Tuesday's vice presidential debate were no fact-checking by the CBS moderators Margaret Brennan and Norah O'Donnell. Now, we know as journalists, it's hard to let inaccurate statements pass us by without correcting them. As anyone who has ever watched a movie with me where someone does something that is obviously incorrect, I can't even do it in my personal life. And this proved the case during the debate.
Or makes a mistake about legislation. I hate that in movies. I always point it out. That's not how a bill passes.
Exactly. We are terrible people to watch movies with. Don't do it. So this came up during the debate. So here's the exchange that led to both Walz and Vance's mics being muted.
Haitian migrants who have legal status, temporary protected status.
Well, Margaret, but
thank you, Senator. We have so much to get to.
Margaret, I think it's important because
we're going to turn out of the economy. Thank you,
Margaret. The rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check, and since you're fact checking me, I think it's important to say what's actually going on. So there's an application called the CBP One app. That is the facilitation of illegal immigration, Margaret, by our own leadership.
Thank you, Senator, for describing the legal process. Thank you, gentlemen.
The CBP One app has not been on the books since 1990. It's something that Kamala Harris created, Margaret.
Gentlemen, the audience can't hear you because your mics are cut. We have so much we want to get to. Thank you for explaining the legal process.
Todd, that was weird. And it was weird for a couple of reasons to me. First, J.D. Vance yelling at a woman is always weird. Especially, it was a real, mods, help me, mods moment. But it was also interesting because it gets at, again, Vance's role in this race as the normalizer. Trump's going to scream about Haitian immigrants eating cats. And then J.D. Vance is going to come in and be like, well, actually, there's some complicated legalese you need to know about. But even the little things about, Kamala Harris's open border and illegal migrants, which, come on, dude. It really, there is something about how you're putting, a thin veneer on a very unpleasant pig here.
But even J.D. Vance was the OG retweeter of the whole lie about eating dogs and cats.
So he's trying he gets to do it both ways. He gets to be like, I'm the normalizer who looked up this particular piece of immigration legislation, but also I'm the one who says that making up stories about immigrants is helpful because the stories will get people to pay attention to us.
Yeah. I made it up and I'll do it again. But look, I have a suspicion here. I think, again, just a suspicion, CBS executives who didn't want to go to war with Donald Trump and all of his online flying monkeys said there's not going to be any fact checking during this debate. Click on this QR code if you like things that are true. That was their message. And I just have a suspicion that these two journalists said, we'll see about that. We're going to be on live. They can't stop us. So we're going to slip it. Look, they did one and a half fact checks. It wasn't rampant, but I think on this issue, they just weren't going to let it slide. And I don't think it came from the C-suite at CBS. I think it came from these two women.
It was just such a wild moment because it just is, again, you have nonsense and then you try to put a veneer of sense onto the nonsense. But it was a weird night, but we did it. We got through it.
And look, back to the insane campaign that we've come to know and love, full of constant lying, constant invective, sicking online mobs on vulnerable immigrants, and saying that the vice president of the United States is mentally disabled. Back to that. I think the debate is over. Back to your regularly scheduled campaign.
One more thing before we go. If you're watching this on YouTube, you should know it's also a great daily podcast that you can take on the go. For your ears. Make sure you're subscribed on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts so you can get your news while still keeping your eyes on the road. That's all for today. If you like the show, make sure you subscribe, leave a review, ask J.D. Vance where he gets the human skin he wears as a suit, and tell your friends to listen.
Oh, man. And if you're into reading, and not just transcripts of two Midwesterners trying to be polite through their seething hatred like me, What A Day is also a nightly newsletter. Check it out and subscribe at crooked.com/subscribe.
I'm Jane Coaston.
And I'm Todd Zwillich.
And cut J.D. Vance's mic forever.